Several great works appeared at the turn of the 20th century, like the wonderful Wizard of Oz and Freud's The Interpretation of Dreams. Perhaps the most surprising was this 60-page storybook by Sholem Aleichem. Written in 1900, but not published until a year later, it may also have taken Sholem Aleichem by surprise, because he had never written anything like it before. The title page read, A Meise on an Eck, a story without an end, and was subtitled Herausgenommen von an alten Pinkes und beputzt, taken from an old chronicle and embellished. Sholem Aleichem was not known to be a recycler of old stories. A Pinkes, moreover, was a traditional book of records. Pinkesim were written in a pastiche of Hebrew and Yiddish that hardly made for easy reading. No wonder it needed embellishment. Even as embellished, however, Sholem Aleichem's Story Without an End was tough going. It was funny, but in a contrived and complicated way. What's more, it appeared under the banner of Bildung, a German loanword that meant education. In the new Yiddish lexicon, this stood for secular knowledge. As you can see from the two stamps, the copy in front of you was well-traveled, having gone from Warsaw to Yafo to Paris before reaching us. What universal body of learning could be gleaned from an old communal register? Secular or not, the very first words in Hebrew and Yiddish preserve the echo of a famous biblical backstory. Ish hoya Dodia, a Mensch ist gewesen in Zlodejevke, a Städtel, was liegt in der Zwiebel von Mazepevke, nicht weit von Chaplapowitsch und Kozodoyevka, nicht zwischen Jampele und zwischen Stricht. Punkt auf dem Weg, was se folgt von Pische-Jabede durch Petschich-Wost, Kintetrewitz und von dorten Kinjehopitz, und Schmoi Shimen-Elye. Und sein Name ist gewesen Shimen-Elye. Und gerufen hat man ihm Shimen-Elye Shma Kolenu. Machmes beim Davenen in Schul hat gehabt a Teve, schreien, arbeiten, singen, ziklen, sich auf Kolei Koiles. Vehoya ish hoya Zlodejevka. There was a man in Zlodejevka, a town near Mazepevka, not far from Chaplapovich and Kozodoyevka, between Yampele and Stricht, just on the way from Pische-Jabede to Petschich-Wost to Tetrovitz, and from there to Yehopitz. Ushmoi Shimen-Elye, and his name was Shimen-Elye. But he was called Shimen-Elye Shma Kolenu because when he said his prayers in synagogue, he had a way of working himself up, putting a trill into his prayers, and singing them at the top of his voice. Vehoya ho-ish chayet. And the man was a tailor. Ish hoya be ushmoi is the opening line of the book of Job. Not the happiest book in the Hebrew Bible, but Sholem Aleichem's personal favorite. The reader is given no time to ponder how, if at all, Shimen-Elye's fate is bound up with Job's. Because from the heights of biblical Hebrew, we are thrust headlong into a veritable maze of place names. No GPS can help us here because it's almost impossible to tell apart what's real and what's imaginary. Only 2 of these 10 place names are locatable on a map of Ukraine, Yampele and Stricht. Another 2 are place names already familiar to readers of Sholem Aleichem. Mazepevka, named after Ivan Mazepa, a ferocious Ukrainian hetman of the 18th century, and Yehopitz, which is to say Kiev. All the rest are straight out of 19th century shtetl satire. The very sound of Pische-Jabede and Petschich-Wost signals that we're stuck deep inside the Slavic outback. Since Chaplapovich comes from the Yiddish adverb chaplap, which means haphazardly, it's obvious that only Jews live in such godforsaken places. As for the two towns of consequence to our story, Shimen-Elye's birthplace, Zlodoyevka, means town of thieves, and the neighboring Kozodoyevka means Goatsville. In short, we're in some Neverland, where a person can never get lost, because wherever he goes, he bumps up against the same thing. Starting with our main protagonist. Who ever heard of someone named Shma Kolenu? Shma Kolenu is Hebrew for hear our voice, and comes most famously from the penitential prayers, the slichot, recited in the month leading up to the high holidays. Why this nickname? Shimen-Elye, we now learn, barely ekes out a living as a patchwork tailor, stitching old clothes back together. Probably his fellow tailors came up with the name because, as we have just read, he had a way of working himself up, putting a trill into his prayers, and singing them at the top of his voice. His speech is riddled with quotations, a veritable patchwork, just like the tailoring he did. I quote, "Among the laborers and guildsmen, Shimen-Elye Shma Kolenu was thought of as a scholar. For them, this meant that he was someone who understood the small print of Torah explication, because Shimen-Elye liked to sprinkle his speech with passages, sometimes whole chapters of Gemara, of Midrash, made out of whole cloth. The people, I am small, today the world was created, here you are, creator of all light, and other such words, which he always had ready at hand. On top of all this, he had a tolerably good, if somewhat loud, voice, tending toward a treble. He understood all the styles of prayer and knew all the melodies and variations by heart. He was madly eager to get at the podium. Shma Kolenu fits him to a T. Not only does he love to pray, he loves to show off his liturgical prowess and does so much too loudly. Shma Kolenu is the comic epithet of someone trapped in a textual maze of his own invention. Shimen-Elye lives through his quotations. They are the only way he has of coping with life. Thus, our first impressions of him are through his voice, his passion for prayer, and his fund of proverbial expressions. Only then do we get a physical description of Shimen-Elye at his workplace. He was short and ugly, and his clothes were always stuck around with needles and pins. There were bits of cotton clinging to his curly black beard. He had a little goatee, a flattened nose, and there was a groove down his lower lip. His eyes were large, black, and constantly smiling. He moved with a little dance step. If I were playing Shimen-Elye, I would probably appear on stage looking like this. Shimen-Elye is a comically flawed character who seems already trapped in a mock storybook world where every paragraph begins in Hebrew to mimic the style of an ancient chronicle. Trapped in a maze of like-sounding, godforsaken towns. Trapped in the labyrinth of a language that speaks only in quotations and speaks way too loudly. Trapped in the body of a goat. Sholem Aleichem was deservedly proud of this story, so different from anything he had ever written. Advertised as an old story, it was presumably taken from an obscure Jewish source. It was funny, but in a very stylized way, and if it had some universal design, its relevance to the new century was not at all obvious. Dear friends, this story is meant for adults only. For adults unafraid of going back to the sources. For adults who can put up with a long story that has no ending. For adults ready to suspend their disbelief in order to enter the uncharted realm of Jewish magic and superstition. Well, turns out that old is not so old, and that the original story does not come from a Pinchas. Sholem Aleichem lifted the plot and the mock storybook style from one and the same source. From Oizer, Zinkus, and the Goat, by the pioneer of Yiddish popular fiction, Isaac Meir Dick. As an avid reader of everything Yiddish, Sholem Aleichem certainly recognized the book's authorship, even though it appeared anonymously. Today, only 2 copies are known to have survived, one in the Lenin Library in St. Petersburg and the other in the private library of the Lubavitcher Rebbe in Brooklyn. I worked from the copy in St. Petersburg. Thank you, Valery Dimshitz. Dick routinely began each paragraph of his Yiddish storybooks with a Hebrew caption to make it seem as if the story was originally written in Hebrew. For if it came from the Holy Tongue, it had to be true, or if not true, then culturally significant. Sholem Aleichem loved the absurd plot and saw great comic potential in the main character. Both Oizer, Zinkus, and Shimen-Elye are hen-pecked husbands. Oizer's name, Zinkus, is already a giveaway, since he's named after his mother-in-law, Zinke. All men in shtetl satire are emasculated. It's always the wives and mothers-in-law who wear the pants in the family. Both Oizer, Zinkus, and Shimen-Elye are men of Hebrew letters, which is to say they are completely impractical. Oizer Zinkus is a poor Melamed, a teacher of little boys. Both Oizer Zinkus and Shimen-Elye will be sent on a mission impossible by their respective wives to bring home a milk-giving goat to feed their hungry children. Both Oizer Zinkus and Shimen-Elye have a weakness for liquor, which makes them especially susceptible to trickery. And indeed, both Oizer Zinkus and Shimen-Elye are fooled by someone schooled in mischief who takes advantage of them by switching the she-goat for a billy goat, not once, but over and over, until eventually all the townspeople are also taken in, duped, misled by the hoax. Then Sholem Aleichem set to work. He turned the hapless teacher into a haunted tailor. He turned the goat into a scapegoat. He turned an elaborate joke into an all-consuming quest and produced a comic masterpiece worthy of a new century. The greater a work of literature, the more it gives rise to great interpretations by actors who bring it to life on stage or screen, by artists who draw it, paint it, sculpt it, or otherwise turn it into three-dimensional figures, by critics who try to make sense of it, and by translators who target new audiences. Our story meets all these criteria. Today, we will be in the company of a fine group of actors from the Yiddish State Theater in Moscow, a brilliant graphic artist from Leningrad, and for the benefit of an English-speaking audience, an excellent translator from New York City. Let me start with the translator, Leonard Wolf, whose work was commissioned for this volume. I suppose the time has come for me to admit that in my first two lectures I was cheating the older translations I read from did not do justice to Sholem Aleichem. They modernized his style, greatly simplified his dialogue, and de-Jewified his voices. So without letting you know, I corrected and supplemented the translations. Not so the translation by Leonard Woolf. It isn't perfect, but it's the best we've got. Great works of literature, I should add, invite contradictory interpretations. Just so Sholem Aleichem's story of the Haunted Tailor. As directed by Grigory Gritscher-Cherikover in 1928, and starring J.K. Kovenberg in the title role, Laughter Through Tears, as the movie was called when released in the West, values Sholem Aleichem as a social realist and satirist. To that end, as you can see, the movie was filmed on location in Ukraine, with some of the local population hired to play as extras. Under the Soviet system, the miastechka, the shtetl, was doomed, but not yet dead, for this story was about to become a revolutionary parable. Flash forward 30 years, and everything changed. The Belarusian and Ukrainian shtetl were no more, because the vast majority of its Jews had been annihilated in Operation Barbarossa, the first stage of the final solution. But Stalin, too, had just died, and it was possible for a Soviet artist named Anatoli Kaplan to seize upon this story for very different reasons. Kaplan understood that within the Soviet system, not only was Sholem Aleichem kosher, he represented the sum of what could be rescued from the shtetl past. So when Stalin died on Purim Day, 1953, Kaplan decided to rededicate his art to bringing that past to life, beginning with The Haunted Tailor, the name that Sholem Aleichem gave to the second and final version of the story. Over the next decade, Kaplan produced 33 folio-sized color lithographs of The Haunted Tailor, with a Russian introduction, a synopsis, and a translation of the cited Yiddish passages. Choosing this story was Kaplan's way of underscoring his elective affinity with Sholem Aleichem. For what was Sholem Aleichem's image of the shtetl, if not Kaplan's own native town of Rogachov in Belarus, which he used to visit during his summer vacations before the war, sketchbook in hand? If I had to characterize Kaplan's reading of Sholem Aleichem, I would therefore call it an ethnographic reading, meticulously attentive to landscape, interiors, architecture, and iconography. Why did Kaplan start with this story before moving on to others by Sholem Aleichem? Because he loved its radical stylization of life. Life reduced to its essentials: a tailor, a teacher, and a tavern keeper. A husband, a wife, and a milk-giving goat. A he-goat, a she-goat, and a scapegoat. Here is how Kaplan arranged the cast of characters, not in groups of three, but as binary opposites. On top, we see a portrait of Shimen-Elye Shma Kolenu with his goatee, hanging opposite his wife, Tzippe Beilereze. On the bottom, we see a portrait of Chaim Chona, the Gemara teacher, with his long white beard and yarmulke, hanging opposite his wife, Temme Gittel. Both women have their heads covered with a kerchief. Commanding center stage is a she-goat with her head down, literally facing off against a billy goat. And in between In between are the names of the characters in Russian and Yiddish, arranged inside of what look like two tablets of the law. And at the very bottom, Dodia the tavern keeper with a fulsome beard. Unlike the married folk who are seen indoors, that is, against a blank backdrop, Dodia's portrait is taken against a lush, natural landscape. He is the odd man out. Surrounding this gallery of humans and animals is an outer frame, for indeed, each of these lithographs is suitable for framing. Like the story without an end, Kaplan's lithographs are also a form of Bildung. They serve a pedagogic purpose and are addressed to a specific audience. Why is the cast of characters set within a sacred frame? Why are they arranged as if they were the Ten Commandments? Because most of Kaplan's audience, whether Jews or non-Jews, have never seen the Ten Commandments. Why has Kaplan adopted this style of lubok art, illustrated broadsides, the main form of popular art in pre-revolutionary Russia? Because Kaplan's audience is also functionally illiterate. They cannot read the Yiddish text, even though he is using the Soviet orthography, in which all works of Hebrew Aramaic origin are spelled phonetically, including the name Sholem Aleichem. This was the only spelling system that Kaplan knew, and he wished to honor it. The purpose of Kaplan's art was restorative, not subversive, and certainly not revolutionary. If I had to characterize my own reading of Sholem Aleichem, I would call it a Yiddish Hebrew reading, or in fancier terms, an intertextual reading. I take seriously that from start to finish, the story moves back and forth between the spoken language and the textual core of Judaism, just as Shimen-Elye himself responds to every situation, big or little, through a patchwork of quotations. I want to know how these ancient sources can help us understand Shimen-Elye's character and his tragic fate. I want to know what all this has to do with goats. 3 interpretations are better than 1. That's what I always say. But rest assured that after we've gone to the movies, looked at the picture gallery, and done some close reading, Sholem Aleichem himself will have the final word. In chapter 2, Shimen-Elye enters the natural world, seemingly for the first time in his married life. His wife, Tzipa has identified 2 people in the neighboring town of Kozodoyevka, Goatsville, who might be willing to sell one of their 2 milk-giving goats. Chaim Chone the Wise, so called because of his stupidity, and Teme Gittel, who is called Teme Gittel the Silent, because she has 9 measures of speech. Tzipa Belereza is no slouch either. She gives her husband an earful before sending him on his way. She doesn't speak to her husband. She barrages him with rhetorical questions. As usual, he seeks refuge in his ready fund of quotations. It is natural to ask, why does she deserve 2 goats, milk givers to boot? What would be the catastrophe? She should not have so much as 1. There are people who don't have as much as half a goat. Well, do they die of it? You're very right, Shimen-Elye said to his wife. You know, it's an old complaint, as it is written, to own is to bemoan. Just listen to him. Here he is again with his quotations, his wife interrupted. One talks of a goat, and he quotes, "You'd better go to the Kozodoyevka teacher and say to him, we've heard that you own 2 goats, and both of them give milk. What do you need 2 milk-giving goats? For scapegoats?" After this peroration, Shimen-Elye has no choice but to set out on his quest. despite that passing reference to death and a first mention of scapegoats, even if the word appears only in English, for Leonard Woolf is also interpreting the story on our behalf. Come morning, our hero finally sets out on his quest. Suddenly, he has been set free. All at once, he experiences the bounties of nature, the delights, the delicious greenery, the intoxicating smells of the great outdoors from which our penniless patchwork tailor has been deprived, lo, these many years. That's him, way in the background, on the extreme right, with his walking stick, as he catches sight of the oak tavern that belongs to his distant relative, Dodia the innkeeper. Now let me read you the opening sentence of chapter 3, as inscribed in the inner frame of Kaplan's lithograph. I'll just add the mock Hebrew caption that Kaplan left out. What's written is this: Be'emtza haderech, Punkt in der Mitweg, zwischen die zwei Städte Zlodejevka und Kozodoyevka, steht a Feldkretschme, was me ruft ihm sie die Dembene. Halfway between the two towns, Zlodejevka and Kozodoyevka, stood a forest inn known as the Oak Tavern. Kaplan's visual translation of this sentence goes as follows. The two Städtlach, one on top, the other on the bottom, represent the two poles of desire. They are unmistakably Städtlach, Jewish urban enclaves, not only because they are labeled as such in Cyrillic letters, as if they were locatable on some map, but also because each is made up of dilapidated wooden houses arranged around a marketplace. Dominating the foreground is an ornate two-storied wooden structure. Were it not for a sign that read in Russian, Traktir, inn, followed by the owner's name, Dodia, we might almost mistake it for a wooden synagogue. Dodia is standing on the threshold with outstretched arms. He seems to be beckoning to the distant traveler. Kaplan paid special attention to the architectural detail. This is his visual way of signaling what the storyteller wants us to know. The tavern had something like magnetic power and drew to it wagon drivers and passengers, whether they were traveling from Zlodejevka to Kozodoyevka or from Kozodoyevka to Zlodejevka. They all had to stop at the Oak for at least a few moments. Indeed, what traveler, especially one thirsting for a free drink, that he can schnorr off his relative, could resist stopping by such an enchanting, perhaps even enchanted, tavern? Dodia is everything that Shimen-Elye is not. I quote, Dodia was one of those hairy, thick-set Jews with a big belly and a potato nose and the voice of a wild ox. A prosperous fellow who owned cattle, he had no troubles to plague him. In his later years, he had become a widower and was now without ties. He was a coarse fellow who could not tell the difference between a prayer book and a Passover manual. Shimen-Elye is skinny with a little goatee. Dodia is corpulent, cuts a beastly figure. Shimen-Elye is a hungry tailor, dirt poor. Dodia is a prosperous innkeeper. Shimen-Elye has many mouths to feed. Dodia is childless, a widower, carefree. Shimen-Elye is never solitary, always enmeshed in communal affairs. Dodia is a loner who exerts ambiguous power over people. Shimen-Elye is a Baal Tefillah, he's a leader of prayer. Dodia is Jewishly illiterate, he's an Amoritz. In Kaplan's most brilliant framing device, he captures the corpulent innkeeper standing full length in front of a mirror. Only the most well-to-do in Jewish Eastern Europe owned a mirror. He seems to be smoking a pipe. He's extremely self-possessed and self-satisfied. Flanking Dodia's self-image are two very solid-looking candlesticks holding two half-burned candles. Unlike a mirror, a set of candlesticks they certainly belong in every Jewish home. But in this case, they may signify the opposite, that Dodia uses them to light his pipe and then blows them out. Dodia and his oak tavern are the stuff of fairy tale. A lone hero sets out on a quest for a goat, for his freedom. Before he can achieve his goal, however, he must be put to a test. He must pass safely through an enchanted inn, wherein lives an ogre, a wild and fearsome man who seduces all passers-by, a malevolent force beholden only to himself. The hero overplays his hand and provokes the ogre, who plots revenge. The quest has now begun, and our overconfident hero has already made an enemy of the evil ogre, whose enchanted abode lies halfway between the poles of desire. Anatoli Kaplan's shtetl, drawn from life more than from Sholem Aleichem, is steeped in nature. How can anything bad happen in the neighboring shtetl of Kozodoyevka, Goat's Haven? There are goats romping and frolicking everywhere, both outdoors and indoors. Just look at the insert on the bottom left. But in Kozodoyevka, looks are deceiving. Chaim Chona, nicknamed the Wise, is anything but, and Temeh Gittel the Silent talks a blue streak. So, although Kozodoyevka is teeming with goats and is known for its goats, by the absurd logic of this story, the only milk-giving goat available for sale belongs to them, if only Shimen-Elye can persuade them to sell. Shimen-Elye barges into Chaim Chona's Gemara Cheder at the very moment when the boys are studying the tractate Baba Kama. Ha-hu barcha, now that goat they chant in Aramaic. When it saw a manner of food lying on top of a barrel, the goat leaped toward that same food. Chaim Chona, who hates to be interrupted in mid-lesson, is happy to pass Shimen-Elye off to his wife, Temeh Gittel, but not before the children complete the passage they are learning. Chayva Rabba, and Rabba ruled that the goat must pay full damages, both for the food and for the barrel. Shimen-Elye would do well to listen. He ought to heed Rabba's warning. Beware of what happens when a goat runs wild. The textual references to goats now begin adding up. And as they do, people and animals start interacting in strange ways. No sooner does Shimen-Elye leave the cheder, dragging Temeh Gittel's extra goat behind him, than the goat digs in her heels and refuses to budge. Amen, and the same to you, the tailor said, and started toward the door. But the goat wouldn't budge. She twisted her horns about, planted her hind feet, and made a resounding bleat like a young cantor going to the podium for the first time. She sang, "Meh, what is my crime? How have I sinned?" As one might say, "Where are you dragging me?" Oh, Amen, gamatem, macht der Schneider und will sich losen gehen zu der Tier. Will die Zieg nicht gehen, dreht mit der Hörner, spart sich ein mit die hinterste Fisslach und macht auf a Hilche Kolechel und zickelt sich wie a jung Chasendl, was geht zum ersten Mal zum Omed. Ma, Pischi, ma, Chatosi, wie einer rät. Wohin schleppt mich? Listen, Shimen-Elye, this should be your wake-up call. From this moment on, your fate is bound up with the fate of the goat. Listen, the goat is pleading to you in Hebrew. Can't you make out that his bleating echoes a young cantor praying for atonement? You're something of a prayer leader yourself. But Shimen-Elye Shma Kolenu is deaf to the pleas of the goat. Deaf because he has a countertext ready. A famous passage from the wisdom of the sages from Pirkei Avot. Es steht, Bal korchecha ata chai, as it is written, despite yourself you live. You have been driven into exile by necessity. Whether you like it or not, no one wants your opinion. I, too, not now, God forbid, was once free, a bird, a proper bachelor wearing a vest and boots that creaked splendidly. Man and goat must accept their common lot. The man who looks like a goat to begin with must accept their shared state of bondage. Both have been cast into exile, though neither is guilty of any wrongdoing. It's time for us now to leave Kaplan, the ethnographer, and Roskies, the intertextualist, and watch the same story play out on the silent screen. There is no visual hint of the obstacles that lie ahead in this wonderful shot of the tailor and his goat rushing home from Kozodoyevka. On his way home, Shimen-Elye will, of course, stop at Dodia's tavern, where he will boast of his purchase and greatly exaggerate his accomplishments. After a hearty meal and a few drinks, courtesy of his relative, Shimen-Elye will fall asleep and dream. And in his dream, he mistakenly unstitches his only good Shabbos gabardine, which is an accurate premonition of his own undoing at that very moment when Dodia is busy switching the she-goat for a billy goat. Herein begins the comedy of errors. Shimen-Elye brings home not a goat, but a gilgul, some animal magically transformed. To play up the comedy, the movie version has the pious tailor interrupt his morning prayers to inspect the strange beast. While still wearing his talis and tefillin, Shimen-Elye protests his innocence in front of Tzipeh Be'lereze, which then draws the attention of curious and credulous bystanders. By throwing in the talis and tefillin, the scriptwriter greatly enhanced the propaganda value of this moment, since the Soviet campaign against the shtetl was also a campaign against religion and superstition. Shimen-Elye now returns to Kozodoyevka, dragging the guilty goat as evidence. On the way, he stops off at Dodia's tavern, where yet again, and unbeknownst to him, the goat will be switched back. Barging in on Chaim Chona's cheder, he finds the boys studying the same tractate about goats and the damage they do. The Melamed, of course, is very indignant and sends his wife, Shimen-Elye, and the goat to the local rabbi. Let the rabbinical council decide if the sale was legitimate or not. Both Shimen-Elye and Temegittel argue their case before the rabbi at great length, repeating verbatim what happened the first time around. Eventually, she brings a bucket and milks the she-goat in everyone's presence. If you think the style of acting that you're watching now borders on caricature, you should know that Sholem Aleichem's portrayal of the rabbinical court is even more grotesque than what you see on screen. Like other Russian Jewish intellectuals of his time, Sholem Aleichem had little faith in rabbinic authority, and even less in the effectiveness of the Hasidic masters. When the goats get switched a second time, however, and Shimen-Elye returns to Zlodeevka with the he-goat, the whole town gets into the act. The grown-ups are beginning to believe that the goat is really a gilgul, some evil spirit, while the children start running after Shimen-Elye in the street and call after him, "Hooray, the milking tailor!" Remember the earlier scene of Shimen-Elye and his goat romping through the woods? Well, Now we see the two of them running for their lives. Shimen-Elye is thrown out of the house and has nowhere to go. It was on this hushed night that Shimen-Elye the tailor roamed alone through the town, not knowing whether to go or stand or sit. He moved about muttering lines from the Passover song about the cat that ate the kid. Chad Gadya, an only kid, an only kid. May destruction take the damned goat. The plan is to wait for daylight and then head back to Kozodoyevka for the third time. Except that there won't be a third time, because Shimen-Elye is going mad and is about to cross the border between dream and reality. This is the moment Anatoli Kaplan was waiting for. Finally, Shimen-Elye persuaded himself that the goat trailing after him was not a goat at all, but a gilgal or a demon that would any minute now stick out a tongue 10 yards long or flap its wings or cry, "Coo-coo-ree-coo," for the whole town to hear. Shimen-Elye's brain began to whirl. He paused and untied the rope. At least he could get rid of the bomb trailing him, but nothing doing. The creature would not go, not for a minute. It kept right on following him. Shimen-Elye tried moving away a few paces. The creature followed. He turned to the right, so did the beast. He turned to the left, so did the goat. Shema Yisrael! Hear, O Israel, cried Shimen-Elye, his voice no longer his own, and dashed off every which way. As he ran, it seemed to him that something pursued him, and though it bleated like a goat, it spoke with a human voice, with the intonation of a cantor. Melech, king over life and death and the resurrection. Shema Yisrael, schreit euch Shimen-Elye, nicht mit sein Kohl, und lässt sich laufen in der Welt herein. Und also wie läuft, dacht sich ihm, als Emetzer jockt ihm und mecket ihm noch auf a dienzigen Kolechel und rätze ihm wie ein Mensch und singt wie ein Chasen. Melech, meimis umechaye, v'ne'emanato lachayois meisim. How perfectly Kaplan captures this living nightmare. It is the moment when Shimen-Elye Shma Kolenu raises his hands towards heaven and utters the last cry of a dying man. Shema Yisrael, hear, O Israel. After this last cry, the only reply he gets is from the goat. The goat bleats out a desperate plea for resurrection. The next thing we know, the goat runs off and Shimen-Elye is carried home half dead. Seeing the tailor at death's door, his fellow artisans take up his cause. They are now convinced that the neighboring town of Kozodoyevka had conspired against the poor tailor. Closing ranks, they set out in protest, not so much against the town, as against all those who exploit them, the very people Shimen-Elye used to rail against. This is the moment Grigory Gritscher-Cherikover has been waiting for. Zlodeyevka, may it burn in hell! What keeps them quiet, our big shots, all of them ready to bathe in our blood, and no one to take our part? Who is it that pays the community's expenses? We do. When troubles come, who helps? We do. Who pays the shoichet? We do. Who supports the ritual bath? We do. Whom do they flay? Us. Jews, why are you silent? Let's go to the rabbi, to the assistant rabbis, and to the dignitaries and beat their guts out. What kind of anarchy is this to let them kill a whole family? These are the angry words that Kaplan inscribed on the inner frame of the very same scene. Wishing To mitigate, to soften the revolutionary rhetoric, Kaplan threw in 4 roosters embedded within the outer frame. A story without an end is a story with 2 endings. One written in 1900 at the turn of the century, and the other on the eve of the First World War. In the first ending, the people of Zlodeevka rise in protest as they try to resolve the problem of human suffering and gratuitous evil on the plane of human history. In the second ending, the goat, that is now a Gilgal, runs wild and starts wreaking havoc in the marketplace. And the goat took off crazily, his hooves not touching the earth, taking no care for anything at all, leaping over men and women, creating destruction in the marketplace, a real terror, knocking over tables of pancakes and bread, bowls of cherries and berries, springing over pots and glassware, leaping, breaking, jumping, clatterly, bang, bang. The new ending obeys the inner logic of the story, even as it takes us to a new level of meaning. This is exactly what the boys in Chaim Chona's Gemara Cheder, quoting the words of Rabbah, predicted would happen when a goat runs wild. It's exactly what happens when all the textual traditions also run wild. When a story that began with milk ends with blood. When what began with Shma Kolenu ends with Shma Yisrael. When what began with the goat of the Gemara ends with the cat who ate the kid in the Chad Gadya song. And finally, with a scapegoat, with the Sa'ir La'azazel. Why else was Shimen-Elye sent to the Gemara Melamed in Kozodoyevka, who owned 2 goats, if not to mimic Aaron the priest, as it is written, and Aaron took 2 he-goats, and let them stand before the Lord at the entrance of the tent of meeting. And he shall place lots upon the 2 goats, one marked for the Lord and the other marked for Azazel. Aaron shall bring forward the goat designated for lot for the Lord, which he is to offer for a sin offering, while the goat designated by lot for Azazel shall be left standing alive before the Lord to make expiation with it, and to send it off to the wilderness for Azazel. Where is the sacrificial goat that is supposed to expiate the sins of Shimen-Elye? The goat has run off by himself into the wilderness, leaving Shimen-Elye to die, leaving him to be the human scapegoat. Is this the last word? Must every comedy end in tragedy? Is death the only resolution to a story without an end? Not if Sholem Aleichem can help it. And help it he can, by abandoning the voice of the comic chronicler and addressing his readers directly in his own sagacious, measured, and immortal words. And since you know the author of the story, that he is not naturally a gloomy fellow and hates to complain and prefers cheerful stories, and you know that he hates insisting on a story's moral and that moralizing is not his manner, then let the maker of the tale take his leave of you smiling, and let him wish you, Jews and all mankind, more laughter than tears. Laughter is good for you. Doctors prescribe laughter. Und Machmes, ihr kennt den Mechaber von der Geschichte, als es betewe nicht kein Meure Schreurenig und hat Feind Klogedicke und hat besser lieb lachendicke Meises und Machmes, ihr kennt ihm und weißt, als hat Feind Moral und sagen muss ist nicht sein Sach, lochein, gesegnet sich mit euch der Verfasser metoch schroik, lachendig, und wünscht euch, als Jiden und Glattmenschen auf der Welt sollen mehr lachen, neder weinen. Lachen ist gesund. Doktorim heißen lachen. The storyteller is the doctor of the soul, but only a storyteller who can retell the world's saddest stories and make you laugh. As Itzik Manger said, there was only one Sholem Aleichem. Sholem Aleichem was the most Yiddish of all Yiddish writers. This story with 2 names and 3 endings, it's the most layered, the most intertextual, the most particularistic of his works, and therefore the most universal. It was written from deep within the Jewish literary imagination, from deep within the lived Jewish experience, from deep within the flawed human condition. Anatoli Kaplan rose to the challenge. Other artists did not. I gave it my best effort. Thank you for watching.